One of the things I like about chess composition and studies is that sometimes these studies can feature some of the most amazing, beautiful, paradoxical, creative moves that were ever conceived, yet still have some instructive value. Today we are going to take a look at two such studies. The following study was composed by two Russian composers, A and K Sarychev, back in 1928. I was unable to find that much info about these composers. I presume they were brothers since they share the surname, but I'm really not sure. The study was featured in the famous Endgame book, Dvoretsky's Endgame Manual, and it therefore has some instructive value. I kind of believe in that, but it is also extremely beautiful. So let's take a look at the situation. So white has this pawn on c7 that is kind of one step away from promoting. But we can see that black has this bishop that is threatening to come to f5 and cover that square, or also give a check. And also black has this pawn on b7 that is kind of running and has potential to become a new queen. So, for example, white is, I think, in some trouble because they have to find a way to draw. Because if they promote the pawn, like c8 queen, then bishop f5 comes, skewering the queen to the king, and then if king c7, black plays bishop to c8, defending this pawn on b7, which makes it unable for white to take that pawn. And now if white does anything like king b6, this is very trivial win. Black will bring the king and then push the pawn. And if white takes the bishop, then the king is outside of the square, and the pawn is just running. So this kinda doesn't work. But what else should white play? If white plays something like king to e6, trying to control the f5 square to prevent bishop to f5, then black plays king to e4, and now bishop to f5 is next. And if king to d6, bishop to f5, we basically get the position which will be analyzed after the immediate king to d6, but with black having an extra tempo because the king e4 was played. So it's also not particularly good for white. King d6 is therefore a more logical attempt. White is trying to, first of all, stepping away with the king and then threatening to queen, because now c8 queen is threatened, because then bishop f5 wouldn't be check. And also white is kind of trying to deal with this pawn by playing maybe king c5, king b6, and then threatening it. However, the problem for white here is that this pawn on b7 is on a white square. So when the bishop comes to c8, this pawn will be covered. So after bishop to f5, king to c5, king e4, king to b6, bishop to c8, now this pawn is defended. And by the time we get with the king to anywhere, like king a7, then b5, and now this is trivially won for black, because after king to b8, they will just move the bishop, and once we push the pawn, they will take that pawn, and then they will push the pawn, b-pawn, and promote. So this doesn't quite work. And then you might be wondering, okay, but what else? Like king d8, bishop f5, still I'm in the same problem. Takes on c8 and then pushes the b-pawn. However, there is a move that you will probably never find in a million years over the board, a move that is so paradoxical and so beautiful that it makes me just gasp every time I see it. And that is this move, king to c8. Now, this looks absolutely bonkers. Like, what are you doing? Like, you are placing the king in front of your pawn, blocking your own pawn, and also stepping away from this pawn, like away from the square. So now this pawn is free to roam and to queen. However, there is a very specific reason why we do this. As we have seen in this variation with king to d6, the problem for white was that this pawn was on b7, and then when bishop c8 comes, then the pawn was defended. So we are trying to force the pawn away from this good square. Now, of course, after b5, by the way, b6 here is no good, because then I play king b7, attack the pawn, and threaten c8 queen, so I draw immediately. But of course, b5 is much more logical, just run the pawn. Now, the problem for us is, of course, hang on, like, how are we going to catch that pawn? Like, we are so far away. However, there is a way, because white plays king to d7 here. Now the king returns. And now, of course, if black continues to push before, by the way, if they play bishop to f5, then the game transposes after king to d6 before. It comes to the same. So we'll examine it via b4. White still can't play c8 queen because bishop f5 is a threat. But now white plays king to d6. Threatening c8 queen. Of course, black plays bishop to f5, covering the square, and we play king to e5. And you might be wondering, okay, but what exactly have I gained all this? But actually, this works out geometrically, because by taking this route king to e5, white is creeping closer to this advanced b pawn while gaining a tempo on the bishop. So now if black ignores this threat and plays b3, we take b2 and c8 queen, and we draw, because after b1 queen it is check, and it is just a dead drawn endgame where each side has one queen. Now of course, if black plays bishop to c8, now we see the whole point of this mechanism, and this is king to d4, and now we have actually caught to the pawn, and now this pawn is no longer on b7 where it is protected by the bishop, but rather advanced, and now the bishop can't fulfill the dual function of controlling the c8 square and keeping this pawn alive, because at the appropriate moment we will push the pawn, sacrificing it, and simply grab the b pawn. For example, after some bishop to e6, for example, preventing the king from approaching, we just sacrifice the pawn, c8 queen, bishop takes, king c4, and we take the pawn. Similarly, something happens after b3, king c3, bishop e6, c8 queen, bishop to e6, king to b3. So yeah, very amazing study that kind of demonstrates that even in it demonstrates this idea that this diagonal path of the king toward the pawn makes it able to catch such pawns even in seemingly impossible positions. And this is a very beautiful execution of this idea, although the idea itself is not exactly new, which brings me to the next part of the video. Even though the idea of catching a very far advanced passed pawn with the king far behind it was executed very, very well and very beautifully in the previous study, the idea itself was not exactly unknown in 1928, because in 1921, very famous Hungarian master, one of the founders of the so-called hypermodernism, very original and creative thinker, and famous study composer Richard Reti published the following study that is, quite frankly, one of the most well-known and most often cited studies out there. If you search for it, Richard Reti study on YouTube or anywhere, you will probably get this one. So in this situation, we have a simpler example of this idea. So we can see that we have the king on h8 and pawn far advanced. And seemingly the situation is completely hopeless. If white just tries to catch the pawn, I mean, nothing will happen, right? The pawn will advance. However, due to the fact that white has this pawn on c6, they are actually able to draw. Because, as we have seen in the previous video, sometimes it is better to approach the pawn diagonally rather than horizontally. So we don't go directly toward the pawn, but here white starts taking the route king to g7, intending to go via f6, e5, and then potentially f4 and g3. Because if you take a look at this position, like it takes equal 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 moves to get to g3 as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So basically, you know, going down the diagonal route is no longer than going down direct route. It's somewhat paradoxical, but it's actually geometrically works out. So after king to g7, h4 is of course placed. What else? And now king to f6. And now what has white gained by going with via this route? Well, similarly as in the previous example where we gained a tempo by attacking the bishop, here we gain a tempo by threatening to support our pawn. For example, if h3, we play king to e6, and now we are close our pawn, and if h2 c7, we are also threatening to promote with check, king b7, king d7, and we are promoting at the same time h1 queen, c8 queen, and this is again a dead draw because both sides have nothing but a queen. Now black can be a little bit more crafty here. They can play king to b6, trying to attack the pawn, but we are unperturbed. We play king to e5, continuing down the same route. And now the idea is that we are threatening king f4 to catch the pawn, and also we are threatening king to d6 to support our own pawn. So for example, if king to c6, king to f4, and we are catching this pawn and drawing. And if h3, we get the same variation as earlier, king d6, h2, c7, and now if h1 queen, c8 queen is just a dead draw, even though black can give the check first, there's no way to win this queen. And if king b7, we just play king to d7, and after h1 queen, c8 queen, we have the same drawn endgame we have seen previously, because this promotion is a check. So yeah, this idea of catching the pawn that is very far advanced with the king behind by using diagonaling zigzag and creating some additional threats is not only very beautiful and paradoxical, but also instructive to me, because it utilizes the geometry of the chessboard and fosters like creative thinking and realization that sometimes there are paradoxical solutions and defensive resources even in seemingly hopeless positions. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know what you think by leaving a comment below or liking or whatever. If you enjoyed the video, please make sure to subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Or share the video with friends or like or whatever. Make sure to check some of the other videos. The link, they will be pop up somewhere on the side. And if not, I want to thank you for watching and looking forward to seeing you in the next one. Thanks and bye bye.